Hello there and welcome to another Robot Wars tier list video. This time we're going to have a look at the first Dutch series, or Dutch Series 1. There's not many robots for this one. I think there's only 30 if I can recall. Because Dutch Series 1 had a very unique format. It only had like a few heats whereby there'd be only 6 robots per heat, and they'd have these redemption rounds or these loser melees in the second round, as opposed to second round head-to-heads, which in some ways Series 10 sort of brought back. It wasn't to the extent that the Dutch Series 1 did, but nonetheless, I'm sure you already know how these tier list videos work. S tier is the best, A tier is the sort of good. Well, they're good, they're great robots, you know, they're just missing out on the S tier. You got the great design but ineffective, so in other words, they look really presentable, but they really weren't that effective. You got the effective but really poor design, so they have robots who really worked well, but their design was just not very good. You got the D tier, which are the very average, not that great in design, not that great in effectiveness. You got the F tier, which are the worst ones, and you got joke bots, which are robots which are there literally just to have a laugh. They are not there to be taken seriously whatsoever, and so yeah, you know, something I should warn you about, obviously, because I've recorded these live. I do still have a cold, which is why I've not been able to do these videos for a very long time. And so, yeah, starting off the list is Alien Destructor. Now, Alien Destructor, the patterning and the design of it is really beautiful. It's definitely inspired by HR Giga, and even more so when you see what's underneath the patterning, because Alien Destructor is the only robot in Robot Wars to contain nudity. For those who don't know, if the robot was flipped over, you'd see full-on boobs. Obviously, I think that was the Extreme 2 version, and I think the Extreme 1 version is still somewhat sexualized. For example, it has a large, like, spear coming out of its mouth, and it's a woman mouth, which looks a little bit, you know, it's definitely still more sexualized, but nonetheless, the design is creepy. It's very cool. You can tell it's based on the HR Giga look. This robot appeared in Extreme 1. Oh, damn it. It appeared in Extreme 1. It got flipped around by Chaos 2. So it has had a UK appearance as well. In terms of effectiveness, it was decently effective. It was a Rambot. I mean, for the most part, Rambots you can't really go wrong with. They're there to literally ram other robots. I think it was sort of let down by its battles. You know, it was sort of forced against some tough competition, or at least tough competition in the Dutch Series 1 sense. But nonetheless, I think Alien Destructor was a decent robot. I don't think it's that bad. The tail was a bit awkward. The tail was very awkward, but I don't think it was dreadful. It wasn't, you know, completely unreliable. It has a beautiful looking design, creepy design. Yeah. So, Arena Killer. Arena Killer, we've spoken about before. This robot, it's a very average robot. I mean, it's weird to think that this is the predecessor to Tough as Nails. And obviously, the last time we spoke about Arena Killer, it was in the German series. And my opinion, it hasn't really changed that much. I mean, it does its job. But design-wise, it's not pleasant looking. It's eh. Next up is Bam Bam. Now, Bam Bam in Dutch Series 1 actually looked a lot more like, you know, the Flintstone Bam Bam, which is what this robot is meant to be based on, because it had this big mallet. I mean, I think it could interchange with a normal axe, but had a big mallet. The design doesn't really change over the years, to be fair, with Bam Bam. I mean, you know, I think the axe and the interchangeable weaponry is probably the only thing worth noting. But for Dutch Series 1, Bam Bam, I think it looks a lot more like the Bam Bam from Flintstones, and that's what it's meant to be. Shape-wise, it's sort of like a Dutch version of Frenzy, or at least I think that's what they were trying to go for, but it just wasn't as insane or as damaging as Frenzy, if you think about it. Like, Frenzy was just devastating, but Bam Bam never really was that devastating. Still a great design, and it was still, you know, decent enough in battle. It wasn't dreadful by any stretch of the imagination. This is definitely, again, another, like, A-tier robot where, you know, it wasn't dreadful, but it wasn't, you know, perfect. It goes in A-tier. Up next is perhaps one of the biggest joke bots in Robot Wars history, and it's only appeared in Dutch Series 1, although it did sort of have a success in Dutch Series 2, but it wasn't as memorable as this one. Blue. The entire robot is blue. That is the gimmick. And the team are blue, and they're mute, and everything about them is blue. Their description is blue, blue, blue. Like, what's wonderful about blue is that when it gets introduced on screen, the announcer, the presenter, he doesn't say anything. Usually when a stat board appears, they'd always say something. The commentator would always say something, like JP, for example. But he just is mute because, of course, the team is mute. They don't say anything. You don't know what the hell's going on with the robot. The robot is there for fun, and that was the whole point of Blue. Blue is the definition of a joke bot. It wasn't there to be taken seriously. It wasn't there to do anything successfully, and yet somehow it won a battle. So, great work for Blue. Up next is Botwork. Now, Botwork, personally speaking, is probably my favourite of the Dutch Series 1 robots. I love Botwork a lot. However, and this is a big however, Botwork was somewhat unreliable. He was extremely effective, don't get me wrong. Like, when this robot was spinning up to speed, he tore robots apart. But design-wise, it kind of affected its effectiveness. For one thing, the disc wasn't very fast. It was very slow-moving. It was still very destructive, don't get me wrong. But it was very slow-moving. It wasn't there to do anything. It's got these big, beefy sides and back, which, means that it can easily be side-stranded. It's almost too big for its own good, if that makes sense. That's the problem with Botwork. It's too big for its own good. Because it is a very effective robot. It is a very devastating robot when it goes into battle. It won its heat flawlessly. It won its battles pretty much flawlessly. It was defeated in the end in the grand final. I think it came third or fourth. So it only had one loss to its name, but its design, it's awkward. Its design is very unusual. It's a shame they never returned, because I think if they did return, I think they would have a much more effective design. But nonetheless, it is a very devastating robot. And as much as I'd love to put it in S tier as probably one of my favorite robots, I have to be quite objective and say it wasn't perfect, and that's just the truth. So up next is another joke bot, and this joke bot is Elmo. Elmo has Elmo on it, and it's meant to be Elmo riding a giant lawnmower. I don't know if the Elmo doll survived the series. I'm trying to remember. I think it might have fell off and caught fire and had a hole in its head. But this thing is just there to have fun. Once again, this is another one of those joke bots where it's obvious it's not meant to be taken seriously. And similar to Blue, it managed to win a battle and just lose the next one. It was, I don't think it's as funny as Blue. Blue is funnier, but nonetheless, Elmo was fantastic. Up next is Enderbot. And Enderbot was a Heat finalist. And I'm going to say this right now. This is one of those robots where it's a Heat finalist, but it clearly didn't deserve to be a Heat finalist. It's one of those Heat finalists that, sort of limped its way through. For example, how many times have you seen, a robot in Robot Wars where, there's this one robot that clearly should have just been knocked out in round one. And in this case, it did actually lose in the first round, but it's won its losers melee and then won the second round. And Enderbot is one of those robots where it should have just stayed down and should not have continued, because I for the life of me, I cannot understand this robot. Its design is very awkward. Its body is sort of completely flexible. So, if one side of the robot moves up, the other side will move down. It's like that. It's quite flexible, which is, I guess, unique. But it's also got a large axe in the middle. So the flexible robot design and a big axe, it doesn't really bode that well. Or at least in my opinion, it doesn't really, help itself. Pardon. And throughout its fights, it just, like I said, it just sort of limped its way through. In the first battle, it got quickly knocked out. I think it got knocked out like within like 10 seconds of the fight beginning. Like, that's how quickly it was taken out. But then went through the loser's melee because I think the other robots more or less killed each other, and Nice Thing just sort of limped about in the background. And then it somehow survived another one. It like Enderbot didn't do anything to impress me. It didn't do anything to impress me. And I'm not going to say it's F tier though, because I think there is some uniqueness to Enderbot, but Enderbot was definitely like not a very good robot. Flexstream is what a cool name, all things considered. Like, it's a weird name, but it's a cool name when you hear about it. Flexstream is it's a tracked robot, I believe. And it had a saw blade, and it sort of came off on the side. It was sort of like the Dutch robot from Series 3, Technolease, in a way. There's no connection between this and Flexstream, by the way. Although Technolease's team does appear in this, and we'll see them later on with their robot, which is going to surprise a few people if you didn't know that fact. But on to Flexstream. Flexstream, I've never really cared for Flexstream. Its design is kind of boring, you know. I often praise robots for having the Perspex design. I do like Perspex looking robots. I love the see-through and see all the internal stuff. But in the case of Flexstream, it just didn't look that great. Like, I don't know. It's not like Robot the Bruce, where, you know, despite it being basically a box on wheels, it was still really pretty looking. It was still pretty cool to look at. Or, you know, kilohertz. Flexstream, on the other hand, it didn't really have any of that. It looked kind of weird and ugly. You know, I think they had like this warpy like pattern across the sides. If you've seen any of the like live events stuff, because it appeared in the Dutch robo games. But aside from that, like, there's not really much to say about Flexstream. It was a very forgettable robot. Like, I barely remember much from Flexstream. Honestly, Flexstream, I don't want to call it F tier either, but it's definitely not that great. So up next is Hammerhead, the original Hammerhead. Now, I'm sure most people remember the Series 7 / Dutch Series 2 Hammerhead, which looks really cool. This is the original Hammerhead, and my god, is it one of the ugliest looking robots I've ever seen. Like, this thing is just awful to look at. This thing is like, it's like something you make in like Robot Arena, or something you make in the old Robot Wars games. You know, something so basic and just, it's just so hideous. Like, this is probably one of the ugliest, if not the ugliest robot. Actually, no, there is another. I've just remembered, but it's not a pretty sight. I like the idea that it's got like this hammerhead spinner, which is hence the name Hammerhead. And it wasn't too bad. Like, it was surprisingly decent in battle. It's quite slow. But my god, is it ugly. It was ugly. It had a very weird looking flipper as well. Like, its flipper was literally just a panel on the back with like a tiny little like spike at the bottom to try and like flip robots, and I think it actually managed to flip a robot, surprisingly so. Thankfully they did change that design, but yeah, what an ugly looking robot. Up next is Lizard. Now, Lizard spelt with 2 Z's, or Lizard. Lizard is one of those robots that you're always surprised to see do so well, and in this case it got to second place, and I think it gets second in Series 2 as well. Like like Lizard is one of those robots that, how the hell does this thing always do well? How the hell is this thing like a consistent grand finalist? I really like the Series 1 Lizard more so than the Series 2 Lizard, personally speaking. Even though the Series 2 Lizard, I guess you could argue, is more, you know, better. Although, saying that, this one was a lot more reliable. So Lizard, despite its very high placing of being runners-up of the series, actually lost in the first round. And it had to go through the loser's melee, and it managed to win every other fight after that. Its weaponry is this tail, which sort of flops about in the back, and it mostly uses raw strength and brutality. And I just love the little like grinning like lizard pattern on the front. I think that looks great. I love the little red eyes that are like bulging at the top. Lizard, it was surprisingly reliable and durable. Like, it could, like, lose a panel, get torn apart, like, the whole armor could literally just flip off, and it would still be working. Like, that's the thing about Lizard. Lizard was always, you know, it was always able to survive stuff. Like, despite its awkwardness, I've always loved Lizard. Like, Lizard, for me, is an S tier robot. It's one of those robots which manages to have a great design. It manages to be very effective, and it manages to do really well, despite the fact that it shouldn't, really. So, next up is Maximil. Now, some people probably remember the Extreme 1 Maximil. Now, Extreme 1 Maximil, I will say, I think is a much more prettier looking robot. I think the orange colour scheme looked so much better. This one isn't that bad looking. I still think it looks great. But Maximil, just like it was in Extreme 1, wasn't reliable. It wasn't that effective. The spinner, the flywheel, was essentially paper. It was very, very flexible. It was very weak, very ineffective. It was, you know, it was type of way where I'd break down after like one hit, or like being flipped once or twice. You know, it wasn't very effective. What I'm trying to say is, that said, I do still like its design. I do prefer the Extreme 1 design. I think that one looks so much more visually appealing. But this design is still pretty good. I believe the team worked on windmills, which is why it's got that windmill design. Of course, the name is Maximil, which, you know, refers to windmills. But yeah, Maximil is one of those robots which I do have a bit of a soft spot for. I do quite like the robot, despite the fact that it wasn't effective whatsoever. Like, I do quite like Maximil. Next up is Maximum Torque. Maximum Torque isn't related to the Team Torque machines from Scotland. And Maximum Torque, I believe, is one of the only robots to fight only one battle, because I think there's at least 2 episodes in the Dutch Series 1 where robots were so badly damaged they couldn't fight in like the loser's melee, and I think in this case Maximum Torque was one of them, and I think it was the first victim of Botwork. And I've already mentioned how brilliant Botwork was, but obviously, you know, poor Maximum Torque, because Maximum Torque looks really nice. It looks really good looking, but we didn't really see much of it. I mean, it seemed quite aggressive. It definitely seemed quite aggressive, and it definitely seemed pretty, you know, fairly built. Because I believe, but, you know, again, because it faced Botwork, who, despite Botwork having a very awkward design, was a very destructive robot, it just got mangled on the sides. I think I'm getting it right. I might be confusing with another robot. But nonetheless, like, Maximum Torque, if I remember right, the Maximum Torque and Botwork fight is a really good fight as well. Like, that one is a genuinely good fight. But yeah, the problem with Maximum Torque is that we didn't see much of it. It seemed decent enough, but we didn't see much of it. So I'm gonna be hesitant. I'm gonna put it in the great design, but ineffective. But only because we didn't see enough of it to get a proper judgment. Because I think Botwork got the wheels too quickly for it. But nonetheless, it was a very good looking robot. It's a shame we only saw it once. Miss Sugar, and not the heavy metal band Miss Sugar. This is the robot Miss Sugar. Miss Sugar is interesting because when you look at Miss Sugar, like, is the type of robot that you'd think, looking at it, would be a really effective robot. But then, how do I put it? It wasn't that effective, but it wasn't ineffective. Like, it was very unreliable, Miss Sugar. It was always the type of robot that would start smoking after like a minute. You know, it would, if a robot wasn't going to get knocked out by its flywheel, which was like as reliable as, you know, a dead cat, then it would just start smoking and just implode on itself. It wasn't, but at the same time, that wasn't like always the case. Like, Miss Sugar did still, you know, do a lot of things. Its design is really cool looking. Its design is very much your typical Axelbot style design, where, you know, you can flop both sides. It sort of reminds me of Scar in a way. It's just it's like a short, fatter version of Scar from Series 4. You know, I do like the design a lot. I think the Series 2 one was a far more effective machine, if I can recall. But Meshuggah, I'm always like mixed on, because on one hand, when it was effective, it was really effective. But on the other hand, when it was like, it was so unreliable, it would just implode on itself. At the same time, its design is really good. I'm going to put it in the great design but ineffective, simply because I do like it. But it was definitely a odd robot. It was definitely like, oh, okay, you don't really know what to say. It is definitely like a confused robot, I guess you could say, Meshuggah. Neat Machine. Neat Machine is the first of the Neat Machine, or Neater machines. I've always found that name really weird, Neat Machine. And I found the design even weirder, because it's an axe bot. It's an axe bot, and it looks normal, but then you see the front of it, and it has this like weird like prodding like pickaxe thing. Which, by the way, if you look at the size of the axe and you look at the angle that it comes down on, that pickaxe at the front prevents it from actually hitting another robot, unless that robot drives on top of the pickaxe at the front and gets hammered on top. Like, honestly, Neat Machine's design is always infuriated me in a way, because it's like, you'd think they wouldn't have that stupid thing on the front, but they do. And the worst part is it gets worse in the more appearances that it appears in. Like, in Series 7, it has like a gigantic, like almost like tennis racket thing at the front, and it, like, you're not going to get anyone with it. And I mean, to be fair, they do get some robots. It's also one of those robots that can't self-right despite having an axe. Like, that's something that I've noticed, is that this robot could get flipped over, and because it gets flipped over, it, you'd think it could use its axe to self-right. No, this robot can't. This robot genuinely cannot self-right, which is really weird. But again, like, I don't really hate Neat Machine, because Neat Machine, is still a great robot in its own right. It's definitely one of the more memorable Dutch robots, one of the robots that a lot of people will remember from the Dutch series, both of them, and all, in the UK series. But again, like, Neat Machine just, I don't know, Neat Machine just confuses me. It confuses me in its design. It confuses me just by how it can't self-right despite having an axe. It's a very confused robot, but nonetheless, I do still quite like it, and I'm going to put it in the effective but poor design category. I'm going to put it just below Botwork, because I think at the end of the day, it's still a decent robot. It's just, yeah. So Pathetica. Pathetica is, it's weird, because Pathetica is one of those like visually like standout-ish robots that you remember, but I think Pathetica is one of these other examples of a robot that just couldn't fight in the loser's melee, so it had to withdraw, which is a shame, because I think design-wise Pathetica looked great. Unfortunately, Pathetica, I believe, was in the final heat, or one of the final two heats, I should say, which were pretty infamous for being quite boring and slow episodes of Dutch Series 1, which is a real shame, because, it started off pretty strong with the first few episodes, and then the final two just weren't very good. Not including the grand final, of course, but Pathetica was, I might be confusing Pathetica for another robot. Nah, I don't know. Pathetica is definitely, and I wish that wouldn't pop up. Stupid thing. I digress. Pathetica, I love the design, I love the patterning, I love it so much. It actually reminds me of the John Pertwee Doctor Who opening titles, with the colours. But it's also got these teeth at the front. I mean, it looks great. It looks decent. In terms of effectiveness, if I could recall, I believe Pathetica was a very ineffective robot. It wasn't that great. Nonetheless, I don't think it's terrible. I think it's just an unreliable robot that just happened to look decent. So yeah, Pathetica, I'm going to put you in great design but ineffective. Next up is perhaps one of the most famous, if not the most famous, of the Dutch machines. It is Philippa. Philippa obviously appeared in Series 3 beforehand with Depoposaurus Rex, and it's interesting how these robots literally look the same, except Philippa is a improvement by a long shot. It has a proper lifter, a proper flipper, whereas Dilophosaurus Rex was a lot more slower and its lifter wasn't that effective. I mean, it got flipped over by Deator twice, which says a lot. But nonetheless, like, it's a very unusual shaped robot, Philippa, but Philippa makes up for it for how effective it was. You know, this robot was a really good robot. It was able to flip robots over. It was able to control battles with it, you know, the way it was designed. It's a very, like, long, silvery, you know, almost fish-like looking robot. I don't know about you, but I've always imagined this thing being like a fish of sorts. I don't know if that was intentional, but I don't know. Obviously, this robot was hugely popular in the Dutch series, so much so that it appeared like several times during the UK Robot Wars. Like, this robot was just everywhere, which is why it's probably the most famous and probably the most beloved of all the Dutch robots, for good reason. Like, it was able to do very well. I believe it got to the heat final in this series. I'm trying to remember, does it get to the heat final or does it get to the grand final? In one of the series, it gets to the grand final. I don't know whether it's this one or the next one, but nonetheless, like, it still did a decent enough job in its own right. Its design may be very unusual, but that, you know, it makes up for it for just how brilliant it was. Great pusher, great flipper, great lifter. I don't think it's as good as Lizard, though. Lizard is still better. So, I don't know if the Dutch have, like, no, like, idea of copyright at all, because, you know, they've managed to have they managed to get quite a few which are obviously, you know, infringing on certain IPs, and Pikachu is probably one of the other examples. Pikachu, design-wise, Pikachu looks like it's this horrible-looking spinner that will go into the back of you and, like, rip you apart. The reality is, it was not very effective. Pikachu just wasn't very effective. It was easily bulldozed by its competitors. I mean, I believe it survived its first round, and then the second round it met Botwork. I know that, yeah, I think it was Botwork that it met. I'm very sure, because I think Botwork faced Maximum Torque, then Pikachu, if I can recall. But yeah, in both cases, it went for the tires. Pikachu, like, there was a Pika 1, and I've seen pictures of what Pika 1 looked like, and Pika 1 looked very weird. All I'm going to say is that it looked incredibly weird. Like, Pika 1, I'm kind of glad we never saw that in combat. It actually looked a bit like Bot Out of Hell from Series 5. Pikachu looks far better. It looks so much more appealing to the eyes, even if it wasn't that effective. But nonetheless, yeah, I mean, this is another example where the design looks great, but the, you know, robot wasn't that brilliant. I'm going to put it there, above Pathetica, but below Maxwell. Oh, dear. So, I remember when I said about how there are certain roboteers or certain robots which, you know, when you know who the robots they create, you know that they're famous for this certain type of robot which is absolutely aggressive, absolutely powerful, absolutely brutal in battle. But then you'd also remember that it had some very unusual first robots or predecessors. Project One is definitely among them. And for those that don't know, Project One does have a successor. It has two successors, actually. One which was one that was called Project 2, which we'll get onto that when we get onto Series 2 of the Dutch Wars. And the other, perhaps more infamously so, or more famously so to many fans, is Gravity. Believe it or not, Gravity's granddaddy is this thing. You know, this thing is what, in a way, inspired Gravity. Oh dear. What a way to start. Project One, it has no armor. The robot is barely finished. The axe is too great for its own good. I don't think it won a single fight. I think it was... I'm trying to remember. Was it this or Pathetica that wasn't able to compete in the losers melee? I mean, I don't remember. But yeah, this thing has no armor. It's unfinished, and it didn't really work at all. I believe the problem was they were trying so hard to make their weapons so powerful and effective that they kind of forgot about the weight constraints. And as a result, most of the robot didn't really, get built. So what you're looking at is a naked robot with barely anything to show. And, even though it was meant to show this powerful axe, the axe didn't really do anything. This is F tier. Project 1 is F tier, without a doubt. Up next is another very, very, very famous Dutch machine, and it's the Series 2 champion, but for Series 1, we have Pulverizer. Not Pulverizer, Pulverizer. With 2 L's. It's very unusual spelling for the name. I mean, naming aside, it's very weird looking at the first version of Pulverizer. Because, I don't know, there's something about that looks odd. Like, when you look at the future editions of the Pulverizer machines, it's got like these domed wheels. It looks really cool looking. Its spinner looks really appealing. But then the first version has like, it's got very, the wheels are exposed completely. There's nothing like protecting them at all. And its flywheel has like these big, like gient teeth on it, and it even has like these side bits which look very odd. Oh, jeez. Pardon me, but Pulverizer is it's something. It's that's the best way I can describe. It's something. It's a robot which you can't help but feel, it's not bad, it's not dreadful, but I think because when you see the future editions of Pulverizer, you start to realise, okay, it does get better from here. That said, this was still a very good robot. I don't think it survived its heat, though, which is kind of ironic considering that it would become champion in Series 2, but in this, it didn't really survive its heat. I believe it got mangled by Twisted Metal, which we got to wait more or less to the end for. But still, I think it's still a great design. It was still very effective, and it's still cool. Like, I genuinely do like Pulverizer. I mean, it's still an S tier, even if I do think it's weird looking at it compared to what is to come, like the future edition. Next up is another joke bot, and this joke bot is Pyramid of Chaos. This is probably the weakest of all the joke bots, in my opinion, because this robot, it's a giant pyramid with an axe or a rod. Now this is from Heat B, I believe, and Heat B is the heat which is missing audio for like the first 20 minutes or so. Which is a shame because we don't actually have any description of the Pyramid of Chaos fight, in which it just got torn apart by Twisted Metal. And here's the thing about Pyramid of Chaos. Pyramid of Chaos is, I believe, a wooden robot which is decorated with wrapping paper. It is why it looks so hideous. And honestly, this robot is not there to be taken seriously. It is literally there to just be decimated. I think the thing about the Dutch is I think they have a lot more humorous robots than they do serious contenders. You can always tell, you can always separate them into 2 categories. The serious contenders are always things like Tough as Nails or Gravity or Pulverizer or Philippa. And then you got things like Blue and Elmo and stuff like that. They really did have a lot more jokey robots, a lot more sillier robots like this, and later on we got Lethal Swan. This robot, it's probably the weakest of all the joke bots in my opinion. I think the other joke bots are just far more better, especially Blue. Blue takes the biscuit for probably being one of the best joke bots in Robot history, genuinely so. But this robot right here, it's still humorous to see this thing just in the arena, just there to die, and that's it. But yeah, still it's not as appealing as the others. Next up is Rat. Now, Rat is one of those robots which I feel so sorry for. Rat lost both its fights to a judge's decision, and it was in Heat A. Rat was in a heat full of animal-based robots such as Lizard and Lethal Swan, and Rat has the unfortunate circumstance of being one of those robots which was really effective, really cool, and really good, but it always ended up facing like tougher competition. It'd always end up facing a robot which would just bulldoze it about, flip it about. You know, it would always face a robot that would push it onto the flame pit, or push it into a house robot. Like, poor Rat, kind of got screwed over, in my opinion. I love the design. The design of Rat is fantastic. I love it so much. It's such a beautiful looking robot. And in terms of effectiveness, the whole body is basically one big flipper. Which is what you're seeing right now. The bodywork is one big flipper, so it would drive in, and because of its low snouted front end, it would flip robots over. And honestly, whilst that wasn't too great, it was still decent enough to attack our robots. It's just a shame what happened to Rat, because Rat, like I said, is one of those robots which clearly, if it was in another heat, maybe one of the weaker heats, in I think it's Heat D and Heat E. Well, I'm trying to remember. Are those the weaker heats? I think they are. I think they're the weaker heats. If it was in one of those weaker heats, I think it probably would have done far better. It probably would have even won a heat. I don't know. It is just a shame. It is a shame that Rat kind of got screwed over a bit, because Rat was definitely one of those robots which I think could have had a decent chance. I'm going to put it in A tier because I do think it was one of those missed potentials. It's a shame it never returned either, because I think, a much more powerful Rat probably would have been cool. RCC. Now, RCC is one of those robots which there is so much history dedicated to this one particular robot, and yet it only had one appearance on screen, which was in this series, Dutch Series 1. For those who don't know, RCC is probably one of the most infamous robots because it appeared in so many live events. It appeared, its qualifier battle has been recorded and is, available on the internet. It's one of those robots which, everyone knows so much about it. The team is still around today. They've done so much, and yet they've only ever had one appearance, which is in this. And RCC, all things considered, wasn't a great robot. It's very colourful. It's a rainbow coloured robot. But I don't think it was that great. This one, I don't remember it doing all that well. Design-wise, it's a unique design, I guess. I've never really cared for that design personally, but again, it's not bad. It's not like Flexstream levels of bad. It's just a decent design, but that's about it. That's all I can say. Effectiveness, I don't believe it did very well, if I can recall. But nonetheless, RCC, I'm just going to put at the top, is more famous because of its, ridiculously, overcomplicated history. RCC is, more famous because of how, known it is, rather than how known it is in the series. SATA, also known as Satan, is a devil-shaped robot. I believe this was the heat winner of its heat. You wouldn't get that from looking at it. The design is it looks like a box from, if you're watching this on screen, it looks like a box. The reality is it isn't a box. It's actually got a pointed back end, but the angle looks like that. As you can see, it's got little devil horns and two brushes on its head, and it's got a big nose flipper. It's basically the Dutch version of Dietor. This thing is basically the Dutch version of Dietor. It managed to win a heat, so it wasn't ineffective at all. If I can recall, it was definitely a slow robot. It wasn't brilliant by any stretch of the imagination, but it wasn't dreadful. But at the same time, it was somewhat how do I put it? It was somewhat lucky to get through its heat. Like I said, this is one of the weaker heats, so, in the weaker heats, the robots which won were the ones which were just the ones that managed to not break down. And SATA was that robot, although, if I can recall, it got destroyed by Botwork in the grand final and didn't return after that. Although I think the team did return later on with other robots. That said, SATA, I quite like the design. Like I said, this is the Dutch version of Dietor. It looks almost exactly like Dietor if you think about it. Obviously, it's not red and black, but still, and in terms of effectiveness, it was durable. It was definitely durable. It's not. It doesn't go in the great design, but ineffective because it was somewhat effective, and it doesn't go in effective but poor design because the design is actually pretty cool. I'm gonna put it in A tier, but it's definitely the low A tier. It's the low A tier where it's like, Next up is Scrap-to-Saur, and again, this is a robot where I think most people are probably going to remember the other editions as opposed to this one. This is the original Scrap-to-Saur. This actually looks more like a dinosaur than the other Scrap-to-Saurs, which were like the big silvery flippers. But unfortunately, the big silvery flippers were far more better than this green thing. Scrap-to-Saur, I don't believe it did very well. And its weaponry, I believe, was just a spike at the front. And I just don't like it. I don't like the look of it. I don't like the design. I don't like the, the weaponry. It wasn't that effective. Like the original when you compare it to the later editions, which were a lot more effective and a lot more, better, this version of Scrap-to-Saur is, I mean, you got to start off somewhere, I guess, and this is, I guess, a starting point. Scrap-to-Saur 1. I wouldn't say it's F tier. I'm just going to put it in D tier. At least the coloring is pretty cool. The patterning, maybe, but that's about it. Shapeshifter. Now, Shapeshifter, I've debated on whether or not this is Jokebot or not, because the second Shapeshifter is definitely a Jokebot. Shapeshifter looks very much like it's a featherweight. When you look at the pictures of Shapeshifter, it looks so tiny, and yet it's actually quite a big robot. It was horribly unreliable. It was dreadful in reliability. It just didn't work. It just didn't work at all. It broke down in both of its barrels. It broke down in the first barrel and lost, and then it broke down in Loser's Melee. Although in Loser's Melee, it at least got decimated and just went all over the arena. That's always a good sign. At least I think that's always a good thing. Like, if your robot isn't very good, at least have it decimated in such a way that it's just there's nothing left of it. And that's what happened to Shapeshifter, or Shapeshifter 1. Shapeshifter 1 also had another additional issue. The look of it would change. I believe in the first round it was the Bumblebee pattern, which actually looks decent, but it doesn't really make that much sense. Why did I say shents? And then you have the blue version, which is just a blue block in the arena, and it's just a waste of time. There's nothing really positive to say about Shapeshifter. It was a crap robot. It was a crap design. It looks like a featherweight, but it's actually a heavyweight. It didn't do anything in any of its fights. It just died twice and then got decimated in its Loser Melee. At least Project 1 moved. At least Project 1 was, active. Shapeshifter just didn't. Shapeshifter, I'm putting Shapeshifter in F tier. So, I mentioned earlier that Technolease, a Series 3 robot, which is infamous for being just this big box in the arena, and it's more infamously remembered for being crushed and decimated by Razor in Series 3's International Championship, or the International League. That fight is epic, and Technolease returned, or at least the team returned, with Slicer. Yes, the Technolease team, who originally appeared with this big box robot, which had this little saw that just popped out every so often, actually returned with a drum spinner that would go on to become champion. It's beggars belief in a way. It's one of those evolutions that you just think, wow, how did that happen? How did it go from this to this? If you look at Technolease and Slicer together, they're radically different robots, and yet this is how it evolves. And credit is where credit due. Slicer is just a beautiful looking robot, absolutely beautiful looking robot. Whether it's that sort of purpley pattern on the front, the track design, which looks gorgeous by the way, and the drum spinner, which looks so devastating. It was devastating. It was a slow drum spinner mind. It wasn't like speedy and just ripping robots apart. It actually chucked robots in the air. You know, I think I mentioned before that slow moving spinners were more used for throwing robots about, whereas fast spinners are just there to just decimate. That's not to say they didn't decimate. It definitely certainly did. But Slicer, you know, even though it has a very basic name, it is a gorgeous robot, beautifully designed, very effective. It didn't lose a single fight. And it's weird, actually. It's very, very, very weird to see this robot, which was champion, not return for the next series. Like, it just sort of just showed up for this one series, won the championship, and never returned. And it's weird to think that way, but it did, you know. And Slicer, it would have been beautiful to see Slicer again. Like, Slicer is just, I love Slicer. Slicer is definitely S tier, probably the best, in my opinion, the best. Deservingly so, runners up and the champion are the top two, ironically. But yeah, that's the way it is. Sniper. What a weird name for a robot that I really don't like. Sniper. I think it's Sniper, or is it Snipper? Yeah, it might actually be Snipper, given what the robot's design is. Regardless, the name is just odd, given what this robot is. Like, if you're thinking of a sniper, you think of like a sniper rifle. So, it might actually be pronounced Snipper in this case, but yeah, this robot, from the looks of it, looks like it's pretty, you know, cool looking. It looks like it's going to be a flipper bot, and it sort of is. Except that it isn't. It's lifter lifts up slowly, and it's got a saw blade underneath, which the robots are meant to drive on and get sliced apart on. I believe this was the heat finalist of its heat. It was this versus SATA, which might explain why SATA won. This was just such a slow and boring robot, honestly. Like, I don't like Sniper at all. I think Sniper is just such a shit robot. It tried to return in Series 7, believe it or not, this robot, and it got rejected because, well, I mean, you can kind of gather why it got rejected. It was slow, really ineffective. Its name is odd. I presume it's meant to be a crocodile's head, which would be kind of cool if it had some more effort put into it, but it didn't. It just looked kind of there. Its weaponry makes no sense. Yeah, like, I'm going to put it in D tier, reluctantly so. I don't really like this robot at all. I just don't. I think it's an awful robot. Awful robot. Next up is the Lethal Swan. The Lethal Swan is, again, another joke bot. This robot was not meant to be taken seriously. It was there to just, you know, take the piss out of, and there to just get destroyed or have fun. The axe is so pathetically ineffective that it's hilarious. For example, the axe is covered by this like cloth, which is the swan head, and every time it just hits a robot, you know, it makes no impact. It just laps down the floppy swan head, just like hits the robot and does nothing. I believe this robot somehow did not catch fire a single time during this series, which is weird because you'd think a flammable robot, Flame Pit or Sergeant Bash, easy pickings, but no, Lethal Swan didn't. It just didn't. I mean, I do like Lethal Swan, don't get me wrong, I love it so much. I think the design is absolutely perfection. Like, that is just a fantastic design. But it's not to be taken seriously. It was never meant to be taken seriously. It's not as good as Blue in terms of the joke bots category, but it's definitely top tier. It's definitely top tier. I love it so much. Twisted Metal is the deadly spin of the series. This was the one that all the other roboteers were scared of, alongside Botwork, which, ironically so, I think Botwork was the more destructive of the two, even though this one was a lot more, you know, quicker in its attempts. The problem with Twisted Metal for me is its spinner. It's the spinner itself. Because the spinner was very odd or very ineffective in the sense that it would charge into a robot, about to slice them apart, but then like the spinner would literally just stop working after like hitting it once. And so there would be several fights with Twisted Metal where it would start off with the spinner hitting a robot, and then the spinner would just stop working completely. As a result, Twisted Metal sucks in that department. You know, it looks great and it looks really cool, but then the spinner just barely worked at all. And I think that's really what led to its downfall, because it did win some battles through its spinner, and its spinner did like tear chunks out of robots, but it was such a 50-50 gamble whether or not Twisted Metal was actually going to spin up, or it was just going to spin up and then lose the spinner straight away. Like that's the thing about Twisted Metal. It was so like 50-50 that you could not rely on this robot whatsoever, which is a shame, because I think Twisted Metal looks great. It did lose in like the first round of the grand final, if I can recall, for very obvious reasons. But nonetheless, Twisted Metal, I think Twisted Metal goes in the great design but ineffective category, and I'm going to put it right at the top because it really was like a 50-50 sort of thing. Like, okay, maybe it might work really well this time and just go straight on and, you know, decimate the robot, or it's going to go straight on and the spinner will be ineffective the whole time and it will just be there pushing a robot very awkwardly for the whole match. And that's really a shame, because Twisted Metal looks cool. It looks really cool. And when it did work, it worked well. But when it didn't, you could just tell this thing was struggling in its fights. Next up is Xbot, and this is the final robot for Series 1 of Dutch Wars. Xbot. Now, I should probably point out, this does not refer to the Xbox. I believe the Xbox hadn't been released yet. This was before the Xbox ever did get released. So it's just coincidental that this robot was called Xbot. So it's not a pun for that, in case you're wondering. Its design is very weird looking. It looks almost like a robot with a laptop on the front of it, like opened up. It wasn't that effective, and I don't believe it did very well. If I can recall, I don't think it did very well. I'm trying to remember who it fought in its first fight, but I know that it lost. Yeah, Xbot is a very weird looking robot. I don't really hate the design that much, but it's a confused looking robot, and it just wasn't that effective. Again, this is going to be a D tier one. I'm going to put it just there, because I think to myself, yeah, it's it's a robot that existed, but it wasn't like dreadful. It at least had something going for it. Well, at the same time, yeah, it's there's a reason why this thing lost in the first round. So that is it for the Dutch Series 1 robots. As you can probably see, the best of the best are probably the most memorable of them all, which is Slicer, Lizard, Philippa, and Pulverizer. Those robots are just amazing in every sense. Although I will say this, Lizard does get a bit of a downgrade in the next series, which is a real shame. Whereas the others don't. They get a massive upgrade. So, you know, when we get to Dutch Series 2, you'll see Lizard probably be dropping a few positions. A tier is interesting because it's filled with robots that either lost in the second round or in the first round, or, well, SATA was in the grand final, to be fair, but these are robots which, you know, you can kind of tell that they weren't that bad. They weren't brilliant, but they weren't dreadful either. There's a lot of robots in the great design category. Like, the Dutch really know how to make good looking robots, but there's a lot of like problems with their effectiveness, like especially with the weapons. I've noticed, like, the weaponry seems to be the biggest issue with the Dutch robots. Like, they make this really cool looking robot, but then the weaponry would be literally the Achilles heel. But then at the same time, you have robots which are just really gorgeous looking. No, not really gorgeous looking, but really effective, like Botwork or even Neat Machine, for example. You know, both robots who look really, you know, were pretty devastating when they, you know, got into gear, but then at the same time, they just their designs are just awkward to look at. Like, Neat Machine has that stupid pickaxe at the front of it, which doesn't look effective whatsoever. And, Botwork's very big and bulky, which resulted in its weaponry actually being made ineffective as a result, even though it luckily wasn't, because that spinner was devastating. D tier is mostly filled up with robots which, like, you can tell that they are trying to do something with them. And there's often, like, okay, it has a gimmick or has something that might work, and then it just didn't. Like, it's interesting to see some of these robot designs because, I believe some of them were pretty successful in their battles or may have been done slightly decently, but because their designs were so gimmicky or so awkward, it just didn't work out that well. There's quite a few joke bots this time around. Like, the joke bots had quite a few. Like I said earlier, I think the Dutch did a lot of were more comedic with their approach to robot wars, which I think is very amendable. And they did a great job with at least 3 of them. Pyramid of Chaos, less so, but it wasn't that bad. But Lethal Swan and Blue, like, those two, fantastic. Blue in particular, I think is hilarious. That thing, I'm amazed that Blue won a fight. Like, that's what's brilliant about it. And what's even better is that this robot went out in a blaze of glory. Like, literally, it just caught fire and it fell apart. It's like that's what you want from a joke bot. And their team, like, they just went even further with the joke, being blue men who didn't speak at all and would not say a damn word and would just stare at the camera with their big white eyes, just looking awkwardly and scared almost. Lethal Swan, the axe, just flopping about. It's just great. Like, in terms of comedic value, the Dutch knew what to do. And it's interesting seeing a lot of these animal-based robots. You got Lizard or Rat or Sniper, or I think it might be Snipper. Lethal Swan, all these animal-looking robots, even Pika to an extent. Like, the worst of the worst are really the robots which just don't fit into any of these categories. Like, Project One, it's surprising to think that this is the predecessor to Gravity, which we all know is just a beast of a machine. But this, not so much. Whereas, you got Shapeshifter, which is just, it existed. It existed, and it was basically a object in the arena that didn't really do anything. But nonetheless, I hope you enjoyed this tier list, and hopefully I'll see you next time. And I'm planning on doing a much more bigger one, i.e. Series 3. Yeah, I'm going to try and tackle Series 3, which I'm going to warn you right now, Series 3 is the longest and most likely will be the biggest because it has the most competitors out of every single Robot Wars series, which, pray for me. Hope you enjoyed this episode of Robot Wars tier lists, and hopefully I won't be coughing as much. See ya.